We headed out from Aldo's place in the very wee hours of the morning in an attempt to avoid the traffic of the disastrous city of Lima. Unfortunately, leaving long before sunrise didn't seem to help at all, and we spent the next 2 hours dodging buses trying to make our way through the city. Much of the rest of the day was spent driving across barren desert punctuated by little towns and cities with horrible traffic. With the notable exception of the city of Ica, it was the only Peruvian city I actually enjoyed driving through. We were now heading a bit inland, away from the coast, towards a very special destination. After a long day of driving across the usual barren deserts and fertile river valleys, we came to a strange tower in the middle of the desert, from which we got our first glimpses of what are, in my opinion, some of the coolest and strangest things that human beings have ever made. And the next morning I went to the tiny airport of the city of Nazca to drop $80 on a 40-minute gut-wrenching flight to see these things that I've dreamed about seeing for almost my entire life. I first learned about the Nazca lines when I was very young, from a book of mysterious phenomena which implied some kind of extraterrestrial origin for the lines. However, archaeological investigations suggest a much more credible story for the origin of these figures. In the area around Nazca it almost never rained, so the prehistoric people of this region lived in the fertile river valleys irrigated by runoff from the Andes Mountains. But the rivers of the Nazca region are small and quite variable in flow, and at times they would even dry up. So it appears that the prehistoric people of Nazca made these giant drawings in an attempt to communicate with whatever being was in charge of delivering water to them, presumably to ask for more and a reliable supply. And they certainly did quite a lot of asking. There are hundreds of miles of lines in the Nazca Desert, and on top of that there are many geometric shapes and animal figures as well. Some members of the Nazca community also hit upon a more practical solution for procuring water. They dug an impressive series of spiral wells at the side of the river to access the shallow groundwater for those periods when the river would dry up. Unfortunately, shallow wells are no match for long periods of drought, and eventually these dried up too, and the Nazca civilization collapsed. Back at the airport I met up with a cool German guy driving an old-school Yamaha around South America. He got called away for his flight before I could talk to him too much. And then Gabby and I headed out of Nazca, thankfully away from the city and the giant protest that was taking place there. After we left Nazca, we headed back down to sea level for the most difficult stretch of coastal driving of the trip. In some places the wind was so intense that it was blowing clouds of beach sand across the road. And in other places there was so much salt spray that I had to stop to clean my helmet every couple of kilometers. But we did get lucky and find a nice place to camp on the edge of a farmer's field outside of the tiny town of Atico. And then the next morning we headed out for our last stretch of windy coastal road which the local truckers reluctantly shared with us. Before we headed inland again, we met up with a Colombian brother and sister riding two-up on a tiny 125cc bike. They started their trip with $80 in their pocket and made their way by selling bracelets and patches at local gas stations and to other bikers. We said our last goodbyes to the Pacific coast and headed inland again, over the giant sand dunes. Around midday we turned off onto a road which was marked as a secondary highway on the map, but was actually a dirt road whose quality ranged from kind of messed up to pretty thoroughly messed up. But fortunately we found plenty of cool things along this scenic long cut to make up for the poor quality of the road. We're stalking the elusive giant hummingbird. We just saw one feeding on one of these plants with the long red trumpet-shaped flowers. Hopefully it'll come back and we can get a video of it. Patagonahias, or the giant hummingbird, is, as you can probably guess by its name, the largest of the hummingbirds, and it's also something of a genetic outlier, all alone in its own genus, separate from all the other hummingbirds. Fortunately, Gabby decided to bring along her Nikon in addition to the GoPro, so that we can actually film fast-moving wildlife like this without it just being a blurry dot. Even though this road certainly feels like it passes through the exact middle of nowhere, there's evidence of human occupation everywhere. We drove into one valley that was completely covered with terraces from wall to wall, most of which were now occupied by very happy-looking local cactus. Shortly thereafter, we met up with a French couple, also riding two-up on a 125cc bike.
Have a good travel.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.
Be careful, the road,
yeah.
I mean, it doesn't get better.
Good
So.
luck.
Along the side of the road, we encountered a lonely furry burrow, which in my opinion makes this officially one hairy-ass road. At times, the landscape here bears a striking resemblance to Arizona, and for the first time on this trip I started to feel a little bit homesick. And also about this time, one of the main bolts that holds on our luggage rack worked its way loose and fell out. Fortunately, our gear was all securely tied on and the bolt was the only thing we lost. The next day we finally arrived at our destination, the majestic Valle de Colca, and the tiny town of Cabana-Conde. Luckily for us, Cabana-Conde had a really nice hardware store, where we were able to buy a new bolt for our luggage rack. Valle de Colca is a popular destination for those tourists who enjoy outdoorsy things like hiking and mountain biking. But we came here for one reason and one reason only, to see the giant Andean condor up close and personal. And after a chilly night and a fresh dusting of snow on the mountaintops, we got exactly what we came for. The Andean condor ranks among the largest of flying birds, surpassed only by the largest species of albatross. Even though these birds are primarily scavengers, the people say that they're not above encouraging the deaths of the poor herbivores that dwell on these steep cliffs, and at times they will use their great size to pluck young alpaca or goats from the cliffs and throw them to their death below. There is some debate in the scientific community as to whether or not this is true, but regardless, anything with a 3-meter wingspan that lives off rotting flesh is a force to be reckoned with. We spent a couple great hours watching these magnificent birds soar effortlessly through the canyon and then headed back out onto our wonderful bumpy road that one of the locals assured us would soon turn to pavement. The road did not in fact turn to pavement within any time frame that I would have called soon, but it was still a beautiful drive. Eventually we found our way back to pavement and we began to climb higher and higher into the Andes Mountains. As we gained altitude, we started to see what looked like strange green rocks on the side of the road. This is a llureta, one of the legendary Methuselah plants of our planet. They grow incredibly slowly, something on the order of 1 centimeter every 10 years, and they can live to be thousands of years old. We also saw a bunch of alpacas. They do not, to my knowledge, live to be thousands of years old, but they are still pretty cool. At the highest point of our ascent, we found ourselves in another kind of desert, this one frigidly cold, but equally devoid of life.
We just drove over a mountain pass that was at 4,850 meters above sea level. It's cold up here. Freezing. Freezing, in fact. Literally freezing.
Gas stations in Peru can be kind of few and far between, so for the first time on this trip we ended up buying gas from a bucket on the side of the road. And speaking of first, we also drove through our first snowstorm, which was thankfully more like a light rain of little tiny snowballs. And although the stormy weather didn't make for the most ideal riding conditions, it certainly did provide us with some of the most beautiful scenery we've seen on this entire trip. Oh hey, what's this? Is this another dirt road that's marked as a secondary highway on the map? Yes, that's exactly what this is. Fortunately for us, the KLR is well equipped to handle such situations, and we got to do a little bit of exploring where no one else ever goes. We arrived at our next destination, the awesomely named Silistani Necropolis, to find that the road to it was paved from the other direction from which we were traveling. I had a great time here because the ground is literally paved with artifacts. I can't imagine, though, why the ancient inhabitants of this region decided to bury their dead in giant replicas of takeaway coffee cups. Clearly aliens must have something to do with it. Shortly after leaving Silistani, we caught our first glimpses of one of the best-named bodies of water on the entire planet, the epic Lake Titicaca. As we pushed onward along the shores of Lake Titicaca, we started to get the impression that the locals were maybe a little bit upset about something. Our main clues being, of course, the giant piles of rocks in the road, and the angry-looking mobs of people in the road. We drove up to the first serious barricade in an attempt to ask what was going on, and when the protesters realized that we were not Peruvian, they waved us through, but they wouldn't give us a good answer about what was actually going on, and they were understandably a little bit camera shy. At the next barricade, we had the great fortune to meet up with Alex and Nicole, another couple riding a first-gen KLR through South America. For those of you who need more adventure than I can provide you with, I'll leave a link to Alex's website in the video description below. And we spent the next couple hours together, talking our way through a large number of barricades. At some point, Gabby finally got the full story for us. The people were protesting a proposed gold mine in the Arequipa region. Apparently the big deal was that the government had said there would be no more mines and thus no more contamination from mines in the country. And then they proceeded to go right on ahead with the approval for a big brand new fancy gold mine. The people of Arequipa were understandably very upset about being lied to, and so they decided that some massive protests were in order. And in support of the people of Arequipa, people all over Peru joined in for a day of protest and highway closure. To get through most of the barricades, all we had to do was mention that we were foreigners. Although some did take quite a bit more negotiation, and one we even had to pay to get through. Outside of Llave, we rolled up on a pretty good-sized protest march just about to get underway, and after the people marched off to protest, we cut our way through the last serious barricade, and from that point on we only had to deal with the odd pile of old televisions or telephone poles laid across the road. We finally got clear of all the protests, parted ways with Alex and Nicole, and made tracks for the Bolivian border.
The time is 2:10 and we're about to start our border crossing into Bolivia! Yay! 2:33 and we're officially checked out of Peru and we're enjoying some delicious treats that we spent our last soles on. Alright, it's 3:30, so that took what? Just a little bit less than an hour and a half to enter into Bolivia. So far the most difficult border crossing of South America. They wanted pictures and photocopies and evidence of my yellow fever vaccine, which of course I don't have. So, yeah.
We are not going to the Oriente.
So we're fine. We've arrived at our home sweet home on the shores of the majestic lake Titicaca.
Maps.me led us to a small hostel/campsite about a 10-minute walk down the beach from the little town of Copacabana. The place was full of overlanders, including these awesome Aussies.
Alright, nice to meet me, guys.
So this is our second night on the shores of Lake Titicaca. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to fully enjoy myself here as I've been struck down by what I can only describe as the Inca's revenge, a close relative of Montezuma's revenge. And tomorrow we're planning to drive to La Paz, so hopefully I'm better, well enough to drive the motorcycle. We'll see. So since we left the coast, we've pretty regularly encountered below freezing temperatures. Maybe you can see here, there's frost on the ground this morning. But we've been warm enough, which is a good sign. So hopefully going south, we won't have any troubles with winter. So the point where we entered Bolivia isn't actually attached to Bolivia by any form of land. So we have to take a ferry across the lake here to the other side, which should be pretty fun.
These lake ferries are basically long wooden barges that warp in a worrying manner when weight is distributed unevenly in them. And they're propelled by what appears to be an extremely small outboard motor. Fortunately, the crossing is very short, and it only cost us a couple bucks to get across. We arrived safely in La Paz and met up with our friend Danny and her family. We're very fortunate to have such overwhelmingly generous people to stay with, because we ended up staying in La Paz a bit longer than expected so far. So it may look like I'm holding the right side of the engine cover in my hands here. Well, I'm not gonna lie to you, that's exactly what's going on. To make a long story short, I need a new water pump mechanical seal, and it doesn't seem to exist this part here in La Paz or in Bolivia at all. I'm going to leave the part number in the description of this video, and if you have any information as to how I can get my hands on one or two, or maybe even 3 of these parts, please let me know, and thanks in advance for any useful information. That's all for now. I'll see you all next time.